Dear students, I am Dr. Ashok Kumar Kundu from Government PG College, Sector 1 Panchkula. Today's lecture is arranged under the aegis of Director General Higher Education Haryana for undergraduate students. The topic of today's lecture is the poem The Retreat, written by Henry Vaughan. Let us have a brief introduction of the poet first. Henry Vaughan was born into a middle-class Welsh family in Breconshire. In 1638, he went to Jesus College, Oxford, with his brother Thomas, who later achieved fame as an alchemist. Henry left Oxford in 1640 without taking a degree and spent 2 years in London studying law. He was recalled home when the Civil War broke out, and he is thought to have served on the Royalist side in South Wales sometime around 1645. During 1650s, Vaughan began practicing medicine. After the death of his first wife, he married her sister Elizabeth in about 1655. He had 4 children by each wife, and in his later years, he became involved in legal wrangles with his older children, though his poetry did not attract much attention for a long time after his death. Vaughan is now established as one of the finest religious poets in the language, and in some respects he surpassed his literary and spiritual master, George Herbert. Dear students, this poem, The Retreat, is the best known poem written by Henry Vaughan, a metaphysical poet. Earlier, he was considered the most disdained poet of all the lesser poets of the 17th century. But renewed interest and critical reappreciations have made him one of the most admired. A serious illness in 1651 led to deep religious fervor, which appeared in his poems. Now, Spark of the Flint, published in 1650 and 1655, is a 2-volume collection of his religious outpourings. It is considered his best work and contains the poem The Retreat. In the poem The Retreat, Henry Vaughan regrets the loss of the innocence of childhood, when life was lived in close communion with God. Here the poet glorifies childhood, which according to Vaughan is a time of innocence and a time when one still has memories of one's life in heaven from where one comes into this world. Now, the poet regards the time of childhood as a happy time. It was a time when the poet shone with an angelic light. He was not sullied and spoiled by the physical and material world. It was a time when the poet had thoughts only of heaven and when he could still see glimpses of God. During his childhood, the poet had vision of eternity when he looked at a cloud or a flower, as the beauty of these natural objects was a reflection of the glories of heaven, and the poet was able to perceive those glories. Now, dear students, he was so innocent in those days that he never uttered a sinful word and never had a sinful desire. The white-souled child coming from celestial home felt bright shoots of everlastingness through his fleshly screen. In other words, through his physical body, he could feel the bright beams of eternity. Dear students, as we all know, that while remaining children, we all have purity in our souls. As we grow up, we become all the more worldly wise, and we know how to behave with others in society, and to be sometimes we get deceptive also and make fool of others. But as a child, we are pure, just like the beam of God, or just like the beam of sun. Now, this has happened to all of us with the passage of time. That's why the poet says that the child is pure form, and as we grow up, we become impure. Now the poet feels that as the man grows, he becomes sinful in thoughts, words, and deeds. Now, the influences of the material world prevent him from seeing visions of heaven. So, the poet wishes to retrace his steps to the past when he was a child. He wants to be a child again so that he can bathe himself in the golden vision of heaven. The poet has special fascination for heaven. Why he is so much fascinated by God's heaven? Because he knows that the earth has so many difficulties, obstructions, pain, agony, suffering, which is not there in the place where God lives. So he wants to be there, and he wants to go back to his childhood to have those kind of visions so that he can enjoy life just like the bliss children enjoys. Now people generally like to go forward in life, but the poet wants to retreat to his childhood because according to him a movement back to childhood would also be a spiritual progression. Now it is not going backwards, but it is actually going back to those innocence, that innocence rather, which was part of the childhood, which was lost because of the growth of the poet. The poet himself has suffered because of some deeds which he committed and the worldly wisdom which has made his life worse. Now he want to get back that kind of bliss which a child has during his childhood. Now dear students, I was discussing briefly the poem. Now there are certain type of questions which come in the examination, and one such question is reference to the context. Now we have to answer these during the examination. Let us discuss how we have to prepare for these. Let me read the first lines of the poem from stanza 1. Happy those early days when I shine in my angel infancy, before I understood this place, appointed for my second race, or taught my soul to fancy aught but a white celestial thought. Now these are very important lines, and you have to give reference like this. Let me give you the reference first. These lines quoted above have been taken from the poem The Retreat, written by Henry Vaughan. In this poem, the poet glorifies the childhood. He says that in childhood, life was lived in close communion with God. At that time, he was innocent and pure. But now he is surrounded by materialism and worldly affairs. How you have to write its explanation? Let me give you some example. Now, in these lines, the poet says that childhood is a golden period when the child shines like an angel. Childhood is angelic in the sense that it is both innocent and pure. A child is nearer to God because a child's vision of heaven has not yet been sullied and spoiled by the physical and material world. It is his second life on earth. The poet lived his first life in heaven, the vision of which is still nourished by the child. The childhood is the time when he has not yet learnt to think of any other matter except the purity of heaven. Now, dear students, in these lines, the poet firmly believes that it is the childhood time when a child is nearer to God than any other person. The child has memories of heaven and purity which he loses with the passage of time as he grows up. Thus, in these lines, the poet regrets the loss of his childhood. Now, let us take stanza 2 and give its reference. Let me read the lines first. When yet I had not walked above a mile or two from my first love, and looking back at that short space, could see a glimpse of his bright face, when on some gilded cloud or flower, my gazing soul would dwell an hour, and in those weaker glories spy some shadows of eternity. These are beautiful lines from stanza 2. Let us explain how we have to write its reference. These lines quoted above have been taken from Henry Vaughan's poem, The Retreat. In these lines, the poet regrets the loss of his childhood. It was his golden period when he could not have earthly glimpses, but he had a vision of heaven. It was innocent and pure childhood, but now it is lost in this material world. The poet says that the period of his infancy was the time when he had just come from heaven. Heaven is poet's first love, from whence he has come to this earth. As a child, he has not travelled farther than a mile or two, and therefore he can still envision heaven's celestial beauty and glory. The poet in his childhood finds vision of heaven and eternity in the glories of natural objects such as flowers and cloud. Now, dear students, the poet firmly believes that as a child he can have closeness to God than he can have during his adulthood. He knows that he has committed many types of mistakes or errors in his life while becoming adult, and with the growth and passage of time he has become impure. He wants to get back that pure mindset and that pure soul which was part of the childhood. That's why he wants to go back to his childhood. The beauty of natural objects is only a faint reflection of the glories of heaven, and as a child he can perceive those glories. In his childhood he could see the bright face of God. The poet wants to convey the idea that in childhood man is nearer to God, but as he grows up he moves away from God because of materialism. Now, dear students, let us take Stanza 3 for discussion. Let me read the lines first. Before I taught my tongue to wound, my conscience with a sinful sound, or had the black art to dispense a several sin to every sense, but felt through all this fleshly dress bright suits of everlastingness. Now, these are very good lines written by Henry Vaughan. Let us give reference of these lines first. These lines are taken from the poem The Retreat. In this poem, the poet regrets the loss of his childhood. He says that it was his golden period when he could have the vision of heaven while remaining a child. It was innocent and pure childhood. Now, let us have the explanation. In these lines, the poet describes that childhood is angelic because it is both innocent and pure. It was a time when his thoughts, words, and deeds were pure. He had not yet learnt to say any sinful word which would hurt anybody's conscience. But as man grows up, he becomes sinful in thoughts, words, and deeds. He acquires enough wickedness and wants to satisfy the needs of his five senses. The poet says that in childhood he could feel through his body the bright rays of eternity. Now, dear students, the poet firmly believes that while remaining a child he was close to God. That is why he was able to feel the rays of eternity. Eternity means permanence, and permanence means permanence of bliss, which God gives to a child. Child always remains happy because God takes care of his needs. Thus, in these lines, the poet glorifies the childhood. Dear students, let us take fourth stanza for discussion. Let me read the lines from it. Oh, how I long to travel back and tread again that ancient track, that I might once more reach that plain where first I left my glorious train, from whence the enlightened spirit sees that shady city of palm trees. Now, these are very important lines, and let us discuss these lines now. These lines basically are taken from Henry Vaughan's poem, The Retreat. In this poem, the poet regrets the loss of his childhood. It was his golden period when he could have the vision of heaven. It was innocent and pure childhood. Now he knows that that period has gone away, but he still wants to go back to his childhood. Let us explain these lines. In these lines, there is a strong desire in the poet to go back to the old days of his childhood. He wants to be a child again so that he can bathe himself in the golden vision of heaven. Childhood was his golden period which had enabled him to have communion with God. These golden memories remind him of the scene of the heaven, which is a city of palm trees. The city of palm trees is seen as a second Jerusalem. In this way, the poet longs for going back to the days of his childhood. Every child wants to visit his place of birth. Now that is why the poet says that he wants to go back to his early days. It is just like going back to his birthplace so that he can again get back those purity of mind, thought, vision and happiness. And he wants to regain those memories once again. Now dear students, let us take up stanza 5 now. Let us discuss it. Let me first read the lines. But my soul with too much stay is drunk and staggers in the way. Some man a forward motion love, but I by backward steps would move. And when this dust falls to the urn, in that state I come return. Now these are very beautiful lines, and these are closing lines of the poem, but these are very, very important lines. Now let us first have its reference. These lines are taken from Henry Vaughan's poem, The Retreat. In this poem, the poet regrets the loss of his childhood. It was his golden period when he could have the vision of heaven. It was innocent and pure childhood, but now it is lost, and the poet laments its loss. He wants to go back to that place once again, to regain the purity, the happiness, the joy, the bliss, the innocence which was part of being a child. Now, let's have its explanation. In this stanza, the poet wishes to return to heaven because he knows that only returning to his childhood can give him that happiness which is not part of him now. After his prolonged stay on the earth, his life has been badly influenced by the materialism. Now his soul feels unable to go back to the golden days of childhood. But everyone wants the golden days of childhood to be back. But it's not possible to go back to early childhood. It is only the desire of the poet to do so, but he is unable to do in the real world. But still he longs for those days. Now the poet says that people want to make progress in life, which he wishes to go back in his childhood. The poet's movement back to childhood suggests a spiritual progress where he can again have communion with God and sees the heavenly glories. Now, dear students, this was a reference to the context, and there are certain other questions which are part of the examination system for students. Let me discuss some short answer type questions which are expected to come in the examination. Now, question number 1. What does a child see in childhood? According to the poet, childhood is angelic in the sense that it is purer and more innocent. As angels are nearer to God than human beings, children are also closer to the master of universe, that is Almighty God. A child can still envision heaven's celestial beauty and glory. Now, when he looks back, he can see the shining face of God, because as a child he has not traveled much away. A child finds vision of heaven and eternity in the beauties of natural objects such as flowers and clouds, because these objects are the reflection of the glories of heaven. Now, dear students, let us take question number 2. How and why is the heavenly vision perceived in childhood dimmed as one grows old? As a man grows old, he is surrounded by corrupt effects of materialism and physical world. He becomes sinful in thoughts, words, and deeds. He acquires enough wickedness and is lost in the worldly affairs. Now he wishes to satisfy all his five senses. So he cannot envision the heavens, celestial beauty, and glory in the natural objects. That is why he cannot feel the presence of God. Now, let us discuss question number 3, which is expected in the examination. What do you understand by city of palm trees? Now, here the city of palm trees means the celestial city or heaven, which is also considered as a second Jerusalem. Now, dear students, let us take question number 4 for discussion. Why does the poet want to be a child? The poet wants to be a child because he can feel the presence of God once he becomes a child, or once he returns to that state of childhood. According to the poet, a child is innocent and pure in his thoughts, words, and deeds, and is more nearer to God. A child's soul is not spoiled by the bad effects of materialism, and he can envision the heavenly beauty and glory in the beauties of natural objects such as clouds and flower. Now, dear students, the poet is firmly rooted in his belief that everything is temporary in adulthood. Now, the happiness, the joys, the enjoyment, the progress, the development is all temporary during adulthood or during our developed stage. But once we were child, during that time everything was permanent, because God used to give us that permanent bliss, happiness, joy, enjoyment, and all our needs are fulfilled by God during childhood, which is not part of the developed life. Now let us discuss question number 5. Why can't his soul regain its pristine glory? Now his soul can't regain its pristine glory as he is lost in the physical world's material affairs. He has acquired enough wickedness and wants to satisfy the needs of his five senses. Now, what is the need of the five senses, dear students? The poet knows that five senses makes us or compels us to do something which is unnatural to fulfill their demands. Now, man is involved in so many things which are not permitted by God. Man sometimes deceives others, he lies, he cheats, he makes fool of others, which a child never do. That is why the poet says that the five senses make a man corrupt. Now he says that during childhood man remains pure because the needs of the child remain limited. He has become sinful in his thoughts, words, and deeds under the bad and corrupt effect of materialism. Now, what is the corrupt effect of materialism, dear students? Now, when man grows up, there are certain needs which become part of his life. Man has to fulfill all those needs, and for fulfillment of all those needs, man gets himself involved in so many corrupt practices. He basically befools someone or other people to get his needs fulfilled. He becomes selfish and utters sinful words which hurt the conscience of someone. We all know that this is wrong, but man has to do or perform such activities which are not permitted by God. That is why man has to suffer at the hands of God, because God cannot permit all those things which are not appropriate, keeping in mind the natural behavior of human beings. God has to punish those people who get involved in such activities which are not permitted by God. So the poem and this question clearly indicates that man should not get involved in such activities which are not permitted by God. What are those activities? Anything which is against the natural law. That let me give you some examples of these non-permitted activities. If we destroy nature, nature is going to harm us. If we destroy others place, we have to we have to receive punishment from God. Now if we do some harm to others, God is going to punish us. If we deceive others, we can also be deceived by others. Now there are certain activities which are not permitted, and when we do them, when we get ourselves involved in them, we have to be punished by God. Now we should not get ourselves involved in such activities. Now this is very important from the examination point of view. Now dear students, there are other questions which are also expected during the examination, and these are essay type questions. Let me discuss in brief what kind of questions can come in the examination. Question number 1, write the development of theme in the poem in your own words. Now the poet, let me give you briefly what the poet says in this question. The poet basically describes human life, and he describes the development of a child as a human being. Once a child, he has vision of purity, chastity, happiness, joy, enjoyment, merrymaking, and God takes care of all his needs. But with the passage of time, as a child grows up, his needs become increasingly more, and his personality remains divided. He commits some sins and deceives others. He does such acts which are not permitted by God. And with the passage of time, once he involves in such activities, God becomes annoyed and he punishes us for all these wrong acts which are not permitted. Now, when God punishes us, we realize our mistakes, and we do try to have error correction. That is why the poet says that it is good to go back to early childhood, because in early childhood our pristine glories can take us back to God's bliss and happiness, which was part of innocence and which was part of childhood. Now, list the bounties of childhood. I have time and again discussed all these things, but let me give you in brief what are the bounties of childhood. Now, childhood was pure, full of bliss, happiness, merrymaking, enjoyment. Parents take care of the child on behalf of the God. Now, a child has no worries. He is happy with his parents, and if parents have some kind of adversity, still they give everything possible to their child. Now, childhood is close to God, and a child has memories of God. Child is pure, whereas as he grows old, he is full of impurity, and his chastity is lost, his purity is lost, his innocence is lost, and everything vanishes as he grows up. Now, there are a lot of things which are part of childhood, and all those happiness are very important for a human being to have purity and bliss of childhood. Now, question number 3, what does earthly existence do to the vision of heaven in childhood? Now, earthly existence makes corrupt and do much harm to our childhood experiences or memories. When we live on this earth and do worldly activities, we get involved with so many people, we do so many actions, we do so many corrupt practices, we deceive others, we cheat others, we do harm to others, and we lie many times. And all these acts of ours as a developed human being gives us punishment from the side of God. God becomes annoyed, he becomes unhappy as he notices that we are involved in so many corrupt practices which are not permitted as a law of nature. Law of nature says that one has to be pure, blissful, and to be right, to be happy. And God wants us to be in that state of bliss, which is not possible for us to have that kind of blissful state while we grow up, because we are corrupt as we grow. we become corrupt and become impure as we grow up. Now the poets firm believe that these earthly activities or the earthly existence do much harm to the heavenly vision of childhood. Now the poets laments this loss of early childhood memories. Now dear students, I expect you to prepare all these questions. Though I have explained these questions in brief, I expect you to prepare these questions with the help of your teachers in your colleges. And if you find any kind of difficulty while preparing these questions, you can send your queries to your teachers through online mode, and you can visit your college sometimes with the permission of your teachers if possible. And if you have any kind of difficulty, you can get back to them through online mode or by visiting your college. So today's lecture, I hope, will prove beneficial to you, and I hope to continue this chain of lecture through Higher Education Department Haryana for the benefit of the students in future. Thank you so much, dear students, and see you again.